So I just, thanks again, Amanda, and for all the staff here. You've all been so nice, and I just appreciate the opportunity to be here. I was gonna say that if I had a pipe handy, I would be Professor Plum to join in the clue group with Miss Scarlett and Colonel Mustard and Miss White, but next time, hopefully. I also wanted to say that this is the first university in Mississippi that I've spoken to about my book, and so I really appreciate that. I've spoken to a university in California, and I should be speaking to a class at University of Mississippi next week, and probably one at Mississippi State in the spring. But I just appreciate that the W is the first university I've spoken to. It says a lot about you and the library here. I'm just so impressed with the questions that you sent me. The Fant Library Book Talk sent me these questions to go through, and I originally had a PowerPoint to go through with you, and then I saw the questions and realized I don't need a PowerPoint. I really can go through these questions and talk about everything that I want to talk to you about. So I'm going to jump right into the questions. And if you have questions, additional questions while I'm talking, please feel free to jump in with those. Ms. Scarlett sitting here is going to let me know when questions come up, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. So the first question was, when did you first conceive the idea for the book? And I talk about this quite a bit in the first chapter, but I don't know if I tell the whole story. I tell the story in the first chapter of how I ended up coming back to Mississippi, where I'd grown up, and how I was really torn between whether I wanted to stay here or go back to New Orleans. I was teaching at Xavier University in New Orleans, if you haven't read the book, and the Hurricane Katrina hit, and I evacuated like most people at that time. I was teaching online because all my students at Xavier are spread out across the country. And I figured I'll be here for a couple months, maybe a year at the most, and then I'll go back to New Orleans. To make a long story short, a lot of different things happened, but I ended up buying a house in Columbus, and I met Larry, who's now my husband. And what was a year turned into years, and I'm still here now, in fact. As we're going along, I meet Larry, and I'm here in Mississippi, and I just kept thinking, why am I not back in a big city? I've always, since I left home in Starkville, after high school, I've lived in big cities with large gay communities, a lot of diversity, in places where it felt pretty normal to be gay. It wasn't really outlandish to be in a big city being gay. It was kind of just part of the crowd. And I came back here and I realized that I was such a minority, and I hadn't experienced that much in my life before, that for a lot of people, it was shocking that I was so openly gay and that Larry and I were so open about our relationship. And I just kept asking myself, why should we stay here? There's things I love about it here. I love the small town atmosphere, the caring that people have for each other, the neighbors and friends that we've met. But I still wondered, maybe we should be back in a big gay community, where in a state where the laws are much more supportive for same-sex couples. And I guess, like most people who go through master's and doctoral programs, I was trying to do research. And the more I thought about it, I thought I should just turn this into a research project. So I started seeing if I could interview other same-sex couples about why they stayed in Mississippi and what their experiences were like. And I'll talk a little bit more about that process because it's one of your questions as I continue through this. What were your sources of inspiration for the project? And that's a great question because I really had to think about that. I hadn't thought about that in years. And I realized back when I was in my doctoral program and I was working on my dissertation, I ran across this book called The Male Couple by McWhorter and Madison. And it was written in the early 80s. McWhorter and Madison were two gay men. They weren't a couple, but they were, I don't think, but they were two gay men who were, I think one was an educational person and one was a psychologist, and they were interested in writing about the experiences of gay couples during a time in the 80s when people were going through the AIDS crisis and people were also dealing with laws that were even more progressive than they are today. And they interviewed hundreds of couples about their experiences together, and they came up with this whole stage process of the stages that couples go through in a relationship. What happens during the first 2 years and as they're going through the relationship. And the book stuck with me for years. It was something that really spoke to me because wasn't in a relationship yet, but as a young doctoral student, it showed me that it was possible to be in a same-sex relationship and be happy and to have the same type of relationship I'd seen with my parents and other people I really admired. So it really changed my life. And as I started thinking about whether I wanted to write a book, my mind kept going back to that book and thinking about the interviews they did. And that's one of the things that led me to think about wanting to do interviews of same-sex couples in Mississippi. The other part of it was many more people, of course, in Mississippi know my father than know me. He's a historian who's just written so many books. And I watched him, and I said this in the acknowledgments, I watched him growing up writing these books and the passion and the love he had for history in his case, the field of history, and the way he was able to, the way he's always been able to tell a story about history that makes it really interesting rather than being really dry like a lot of academic books can be. And so he was, of course, a huge inspiration for me. And as I started thinking about writing a book, I would talk to him and say, you know, can I really do this? You know, I can't even imagine how long the process is. And so those were really the two biggest sources of inspiration for me as I thought about, you know, writing the book in the first place. And what made you realize that the book needed, what made you realize that the world needed the book and needed to hear these stories? When I first started this research project, I thought that it was going to be some articles, basically. You know, when you're a faculty member at a university, you're expected to do so much research, and you put some articles out from time to time and do some presentations at national conferences. And I really thought this is going to be a great opportunity for me to publish some articles in some of the counseling journals, my field of counseling, and do some presentations at the American Counseling Association and places like that. And so I started interviewing couples, and the stories were just so rich and so moving. And, you know, the first couple I interviewed, we talked for at least 2 hours, and I had all of this on a tape. They'd given me permission to tape this. And I started looking at the transcripts, which took enough time in itself to do, and I realized there's no way I can do justice in an article. I mean, just this one couple, there's so much information. And as I started interviewing more couples, I guess it's one of those things in life where you start looking at something and you realize you feel moved to do something. And I just felt this drive to want to tell these stories. They were just so moving to me. The love that I'd experienced from these couples as they talked to me and each other in the room, the resilience they showed when they talked about some of the negative experiences they had, but then also the positive experiences they had that broke the stereotype of what people expect Mississippi is. You know, there are always, not always, but there's a lot of truth to the negative things that same-sex couples have faced in Mississippi, just when you look at the laws that have been passed and the resistance to same-sex marriage. But on the other hand, couples told me stories that were from people in their communities that were very moving also. And I thought, all that needs to be told, because if it's not told, no one's going to hear about it. So it just, next thing I knew, I was just, you know, was writing and writing. So that's kind of how it came about, I guess. These really are great questions. How long did it take to complete the project, including interviews as well as the writing process? I'm embarrassed to say, when I started reading through these questions, I couldn't remember. And so I had to go through my emails and look through my notes and see how long this had taken me. And I was actually pretty shocked. I was telling Larry last night about it. I said, I had no idea this has been going on so long. So I evacuated in 2005 from Katrina and came here. And then I met Larry around 2006, I think, after I'd been here for a while. And we got married in 2013. Around 2011, I started asking myself these questions. And I started interviewing couples back in 2011 and going into 2012, the first group of couples that I interviewed. And you can imagine the transcripts and the writing went on and on and on. And in 2014, I started sending out first drafts of a book. And the first presses I sent it out to said they were interested, but they rejected it. They said, you know, this is good and everything, but not sure that, you know, it's what we're really looking for. So in 2015, a publisher was really interested in it, an academic publisher, and they said, we really like it, but you've only focused on male couples. And I had focused only on male couples because of the book I told you about, but also because I felt like at the time that I'm a male in a male-male relationship, and I felt like maybe the issues are different for men than they are for women. in a same-sex relationship. Well, the feedback I kept getting from people that I sent the book out to was, you really need to have a book that's about both gay male couples and lesbian couples. So it's almost like I started over again. I went out and started interviewing couples again, and this is around gosh, I guess 2016, and started interviewing more couples. Started interviewing more male couples and more female couples, which enabled me to have a much more diverse group of people that I'd interviewed. Around that time, I guess it was 2016, no, around 2017, I got an email from University Press of Mississippi that I originally sent the book to. And the man who was previously associate director was now director. And he said, I don't know if you're still working on this project and if you're still interested in getting it published, but if you are, we would love to review it. And so I sent it back to them in 2018. And during this time, I'm still writing, I'm still doing transcripts, I'm still talking to people. And at that point, they said, we want to publish this, but we need you to take what you've done and make it more academic. So what I had done was I had written it for a general audience, and I had told the stories, and they said, the feedback we've gotten from reviewers that we've sent it out to, who publish in these areas, say they want more analysis. They want to know how these stories relate to what's been said in the literature and what's been said in other gay studies projects. And so for the next year or so, that's what I did. It was almost like learning a new discipline because my field's counseling. And so what I had immersed myself in was the literature in gay studies and queer studies and literature about these studies in sociology and history and psychology. And, at the time I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to finish this project. I'm going on and on and on. But after it was done and, it's getting ready to be published, I realized all these reviews I got made it such a stronger project, just made it much better than it would have been. And in the end, I think it's a book that can relate to both people in academia, but people who don't have any interest in academia, but want to hear the stories. And that was my goal from the beginning, was to write a book that would relate to people. And when I put the academic piece in there, I tried to do it in a way that wasn't so dry that it couldn't be understood by other people. And I hope that's the case anyway. Hope that answers the question. And so again, I was just shocked when I saw how long this had taken to do. Any questions coming in, or should I continue with what I'm going through?
That's great. You essentially had to write this book 3 times. That's intense.
Yeah.
But I mean, we all like finished products, so.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Next question. Can you describe how you went about setting up the interviews? How did you select the interviewees? Are you still in contact with any of the people you interviewed? That's another great question. I'm just going to refer to my notes to make sure that I get everything. When I first started the project, I had to go through the institutional review board of my university. So for those of you, I'm sure even students who are listening know about this, but if you don't, when you do research, there's a process you have to go through at the university to make sure that the research you're doing is not going to harm the people that the subjects in your study. In my case, it was an interview study. And the IRB board at my university really wanted to be sure, and I agreed with them, that I protected the identity of the participants because obviously same-sex couples don't have the same protections that other couples have in society. Now, the Supreme Court has recently ruled that you cannot discriminate based on sexual orientation for employment. But in Mississippi, there's still no protection against housing accommodation. So somebody could be thrown out of their apartment or refuse housing because of their status as a same-sex couple. So, and at the time, and I still think it's true, even though the Supreme Court ruling came out at the time, many of the couples were not out at work. So they had a fear that they could lose their jobs. So I really had to protect their identity. So going back to how I selected them, Larry and I were going to a happy hour. There's a little happy hour in Columbus and in Starkville and all these little towns where people get together, other gays and lesbians get together and have dinners together or drinks together and talk. And so I first went to these happy hour groups in the Golden Triangle and said, hey, I'm looking for people to talk to. I want to do this project. And they kind of got into the network. There's a whole, people started contacting their friends and started saying, you should look at interviewing this person. You should look at that person. I put announcements on Facebook. There was a group called Unity Mississippi at the time that was almost like an online resource for gays and lesbians in the state, GLBT people in the state of Mississippi. And I advertised on their site, and I started getting a lot of responses that way. And then as I met couples, they would tell me about other couples I should interview. It kind of snowballed, a snowball process. I intentionally only interviewed people that had been together for 5 years because of the influence that male couple book had on me originally. When they were interviewing couples, they were looking at stages in a relationship. And according to what they said, year 5 is when couples have made it past, there's this, I can't remember what the stages are called, but at the 2-year stage is when couples oftentimes will break up in this study because they've made it past the honeymoon stage in a relationship. And they're starting to kind of get into that everyday life of being together as a couple, and you're changing together as a couple. Well, couples who've been together 5 years tended to be more stable in their relationships. And so at the time, I decided I wanted to only interview couples who've been together at least 5 years because I wanted to make sure that this was a relationship that was likely going to last and that it was a stable relationship. In the end, it probably didn't make that much of a difference to my story, but I was also at the time looking at relationship satisfaction, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So at the time, it made a lot of sense. And so that's one of the criteria. And of course, the couples had to live in Mississippi. I actually got a lot of contact from people who lived outside the state who heard about the project and said, I used to live in Mississippi, or we used to live in Mississippi. Can you interview us? Would you like to? And I was so torn because I wanted to interview them, but I had to cut it off someplace. So those are some of the criteria I had.
This is kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but would you ever consider doing a similar project, but expanding the geographic region so that you can include those people who reached out to you?
I hadn't even thought about that until you said that. I think it would be so interesting to do a study of people who lived in Mississippi but then left, to talk about their experiences of why they left, but also talk about their experiences while they were living here and their context with their families still here. I think that's a great idea. I think it'd be really interesting. Yeah. There's so many rich stories out there. Yeah. Are you still in contact with any of the people you interviewed? I am. In fact, when I first interviewed some of the people early on, and as this project went on over the years, I stayed in contact with a lot of these couples and would get updates from them, that helped me know what was happening to them today. And the really exciting thing for me was hearing about couples who I'd interviewed before, Obergefell versus, my mind's gone blank, but the Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage in the United States. So some of the couples I interviewed, quite a few, I interviewed before this court ruling in 2016. And so it was fascinating and just exciting to talk to these couples and hear that they were either considering or had gotten married since I first interviewed them. And it was interesting to hear their reactions and what was happening in their lives. And I still hear from people, and they still hear from me sometimes. So it's nice. Yeah. These are really great questions. I have to say again, I'm so impressed with them. You organize your book into thematic or subject-based sections. Why did you choose to structure it in this manner instead of dividing it by couple, for instance? And how did you narrow down the content into these themes? And that's really a great question, because for the first draft of the book, I did exactly what this questioner is asking about. I'd done it by couples because I'd interview this couple and the stories would be so interesting and fascinating and moving that I thought I want to just have a different chapter for every story. And so some of the original names of the chapters, you may remember there's a couple in the book. If you've read the book, there's a couple in the book who talks about the elephant in the room. They say there's an elephant in the room when our parents come to stay with us. No one talks about the fact that we're actually a same-sex couple, but I'm sure our parents must know about it. And so one of the chapters was titled Elephant in the Room. And it was that part of their story, but it was the whole story of their relationship. I had another chapter called The Pink Leather Jacket. And you may remember reading in the book, if you've read it, about a couple that meets in a bar in Shannon, Mississippi, outside Tupelo. And one of them says, I see this man walk into the bar and he's wearing a pink leather jacket. And I thought to myself, anyone who has brave enough to wear a pink leather jacket is somebody I'm interested in talking to. So that chapter was pink leather jacket. The feedback I kept getting from reviewers at different presses was, the stories are really great and everything, but we don't think we can market that. We don't think that it's enough to sell books. And that's what it seems to come down to in today's world. So I kept getting feedback. I needed more analysis. I needed to look at the literature and bring that in. And as I did that, the book started evolving into these themes. The reason I chose the themes, and I talk about this in the introduction, the first part past the introduction, part 1, focuses on the couple's relationships with the state. And so it's divided into religion, family, and isn't it funny, my mind's gone blank and I talk about this all the time. It's right here. Religion, family, and community, okay? And I think the reason those 3 themes kept coming up over and over again, because those really relate to people's coming out experiences and the people that are interacting with in their lives. So people talked over and over again about coming out to families, coming out to communities, and coming out for people is not just this big grand event where you say, hey, I'm gay, everyone. If you're gay or lesbian, it can be an everyday occurrence. There's a funny story I tell in the book where Larry and I go to the Starkville Community Theater, and we are, in the lobby, and we're out to everyone. All our friends know we're gay. It's not a secret, but someone I hadn't seen in years comes up to me and says, hey, you have a wedding ring. You're married now. What's your wife's name? And I say, well, actually, my husband's name is Larry, and there's a shock on her face. And so coming out is like this occurrence that can happen daily for people who are gay or lesbian. And so those are the areas it happens in most frequently, obviously, the community, with families. And then with religion, there's a myth, maybe not in Mississippi, but in many areas across the country, that LGBT people are not spiritual or they're not religious. The religious part makes sense because so many people have been hurt by their religions. But I don't think that the average citizen knows how spirituality can be so important to so many people in our community. And so it was so important to tell the stories of people who had left churches that had been so, rejecting of them, but then hearing their stories of how they found a new religious community or new spiritual community that really embraced them and really just had such an impact on their lives and their relationships. So it was just such an important theme. The second part of the book is about Mississippi, about couples' relationships with the state itself. So it was really important to tell the story of marriage because I was interviewing people before and after the Supreme Court decision. And also during this time, as you all know, in 2016, after the Supreme Court ruled in the marriage case, the state passed this law, a quote, religious freedom law, that said that a business could refuse service to same-sex couples if they had religious objections, and that city officials could refuse to marry someone if they had religious objections. They have to, pass it on to someone else. And so I thought it was really important to cover marriage because it was such an important turning point in history. And then, of course, the question about why do people stay in the state? That was one of the biggest questions I had, and the question that people would ask me over and over again when I traveled. I travel a lot before COVID with my job at an online university, and so I get this question all the time: why do you live in Mississippi? What's it like to live there as a same-sex couple? And so it was just, I was curious, and that's what I kept being asked. And then finally, I wanted to tell about how people meet, because I wondered myself in rural areas, not necessarily in a college town. It's a little different in college towns. There's more little communities and groups that meet. But in these rural areas where there were 4,000 people, how do people meet? Obviously the internet, but there are other ways that people meet that are surprising. So I thought that was important too. Plus those stories just really moved me. That's when the couple's love would really show in the room, and they would be so excited to tell me about the first time they met. So.
I have a question, so I'm gonna add to this question a little bit. I hope you don't mind.
No.
Last week when we met to talk about One thing that we consistently said is how we liked like the Mississippi references, right? It felt like really close to home because it is. And so sort of like thinking about that, I guess, have you gotten feedback from family, friends, community, and then people like in like, the towns and places that you're mentioning on your way?
Oh, wow. So feedback on just the descriptions of Mississippi itself?
Anything from a particular story or from
Yeah.
you like mentioned a specific place or maybe somebody worked there like hearing about it.
Um,
Or if you when you mentioned Starkville, like people from Starkville.
yeah. There's a, I mentioned the, we're obviously we're sitting here in Columbus, and I talk about when I first came to Columbus, what it was like going downtown, and I describe downtown somewhat. And I've heard people people have talked to me about that. There's a big piece about the Starkville Pride Parade and all the events that happened around that. There was a lot of controversy at first, and a lot of people have talked to me about that because they were there. Not the couples I interviewed necessarily, but people in the community. And several of the people I know in the community. There's a couple people in the book that are in the book, but you'd have to know them to know they're in the book. So, for instance, when Larry and I get married in Maine, there's a family that's really important to us who stepped in as Larry's parents to be there to support him at the wedding because his family wasn't there. And one of the son of this family is mentioned in the book, and it was very, very exciting for him. He was so excited when he saw this. And there was a place in the beginning. Someone called me a couple weeks ago and said, I just read your book and I didn't realize I was in it. I said, I didn't think you were. He said, well, you mentioned the friend that helped you find a position at Mississippi State after you'd evacuated. And I said, oh, that is you. So little things like that come up that are kind of funny. And then we've had some response from different family members that are mentioned in the book, and both positive and negative. So that's been interesting too. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I love your questions. Let's see. Would you like to share any sections of interviews, research, or personal experiences that were not included in the book? Why did you choose to omit those parts? And I had to think about that too when I was thinking about these questions. I say in the book that in the end, I interviewed around 50 people at the end by the time it was said and done, 50 different couples. So I guess 100 people would be. And I only include the stories of 15 couples in the book because there was only so much room. And I tried to choose couples I didn't necessarily try. I think I did choose couples that represented the themes I was hearing over and over and over again. So there were stories that I left out. One that I really remember, one of the first couples I interviewed when I first started this project, an older man who was in his 60s, I would say, and a younger man who was in his 30s. And the younger man was going back to graduate school. The older man had just retired. And I thought that this is a really interesting story because their experiences of how they fell in love, the age difference, it was fascinating to me. But it didn't really fit in with the rest of the book, so I didn't include that one. There's a story I didn't include that I thought about including, but I haven't even told Larry I'm going to tell this story. But Larry and I have mainly had positive experiences in the community. But one time, we're big sports fans, and we both graduated from Mississippi State, so we have season tickets to all the sporting events. And so we were leaving a baseball game. Gosh, this is probably 3 or 4 years ago, and it had been a great day, and we won the game. It had been this exciting. It was a beautiful spring day. And I don't know what was happening, but we were walking out of the game, and it was one of those moments when sometimes you forget in society that you're different from everyone else. And I think we were excited. I must have reached out and touched his back or done something. And a truck drives by, and the window rolls down and says something like, makes a derogatory remark. I can't remember what they said now, but made a derogatory remark about gay people. And I was so shocked. It was like, it felt like I'd been slapped across the face because it reminded me that I'm not in this bubble that it can feel like sometimes. When you're in academia or when you're living in a college town and you have your little clique of people, it can feel like you're in a bubble sometimes. And that's something I didn't include in the book. And maybe I should have, because it would have shown the other side a little bit. The other two big things are I had done research in the past on relationship satisfaction because I told you I had been really affected by that book I read about the male couple, McWhorter and Madison. So when I did the interviews, I asked a lot of questions about what brings satisfaction to your relationship. And I was really interested in knowing the factors, how they compared to heterosexual relationships, how they compared to that McWhorter-Madison study I'd read about years ago. And again, it just didn't fit into the book. It didn't really fit into what I wanted to say about Mississippi. It would have fit into more about a book of same-sex couples in general. But some of the things I learned were really interesting. And I can talk a little bit more about that some more if we have time with these other questions. So, can you speak about your oral history process? Yeah, this was interesting. I just have to tell you, I've said this 3 or 4 times, but your questions really made me think. These are the best questions I've received in any of these things I've done so far. And so I'm really impressed. But I was trained as a mental health counselor. And so I went into this obviously not having my counseling hat on, because I can't provide mental health counseling to the people I interview because that would be unethical. But I still brought those skills in as a counselor, that, the ability to know what kind of questions are most likely going to get people to answer. It's pretty obvious. Journalists do this too. If you use open questions, you're more likely to get a broader response. If you want a specific answer, use closed questions. And I knew the information I wanted to get, but I also, as I was going through the interviews, I allowed myself to deviate from the set of questions I had, because different couples would have just such rich stories. I wanted to find out different pieces of information, and I kind of deviate. As I started doing more research about oral history, something I'd never thought about because I wasn't trained as a historian. I just grew up in a house with a historian. I started reading more about the oral history process, and I realized what I had done really was very similar to what oral historian would do, except the fact that I was not able to save the tapes. And so I've had people reach out to me and say, would you be interested in donating the interviews to these archives someplace? And I've had to say, no, I can't. I mean, I agreed when I did these interviews that it would have to be confidential. And for a lot of oral history projects, that's not the case. You go into it without having to have IRB approval. And you go into it interviewing people and explaining from the front end, we'd like to use these interviews as part of the archive someday. And so it makes me sad that they're not saved, that they can't be saved. But on the other hand, I know it was the right decision because so many of the couples really had to protect their identities. So.
One is a shameless plug. If you wanted to consider donating transcripts, hi, I'm the archivist and special collections librarian. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
But another question we have is, do you have any advice? I don't know if you're aware of this, but the W does have an LGBT plus alumni oral history project.
That's awesome.
That's ongoing.
That is awesome.
And so we'd really love to hear if you have any advice or thoughts that you'd like to share in the context of this project that we've been working on.
Gosh, I'm just so excited you're doing that. I think that's just awesome. Gosh, I really have to think about that. Can I think about that and get back to you about that?
Absolutely.
I think I'm just so excited you're doing that. I wish all the universities in the state, if they're not, are doing that. I'll just say that when I was in graduate school at Mississippi State, I was a member of the, back then it was called Gays, Lesbians, and Friends. And, then over time, as it needed to be, it's been LGBT and focused on more people. And I don't know what it was, Spectrum for a while. Anyway, I've often thought that it's really too bad that somebody hasn't recorded the stories of all the things that were happening back then, with the people in these groups. So I'm so impressed by that. Yeah.
Yes, if you would like to come back to that, that'd be great. Even if it means emailing me at a later point.
Yeah, I'm gonna think about that. Yeah, think about that. We noticed that in addition to the stories of the couples in the book, you shared much about your own experiences. Do you consider yourself as one of the subjects of the book? Was it difficult to include so much of your personal life? Those are good questions. I do consider myself a subject of the book because I was doing a type of qualitative research in which I was going into the homes of couples and seeing the environments that they were living in. and which really gave me a deeper understanding of them. But I'm also going in as a gay man myself and as somebody who's in a same-sex relationship. Sometimes Larry would come with me on these trips, and I would, of course, I always get the couple's permission. I would say, do you mind if my husband doesn't come along? He can drive off and do something else, but if you don't mind, can he come in and meet you too? And a lot of them were really excited about that, and a lot of them were more willing to talk to me because I brought them along. But because of that, because they sometimes saw Larry, not always, but because they knew I'm a gay man, they were more likely to want to hear my experiences too. And so oftentimes when the interviews were over, we'd start talking about our shared experiences. And I felt like I wanted to tell my story, but I also, as a researcher, felt like if I told my story, the reader would have a better understanding of how I may have been biased in some ways in the questions I asked, because I'm a member of this community too. So I just felt like it was important to, to say that from the start and tell my own experiences. And let's see. Oh, was it hard to include so much of your, see, I lost it.
It's something along the lines of, was it hard to include so much of yourself?
Yeah. I'd never written a book before, but I'd read some books about, different writers have written books about how you go about writing a book, or just advice for doing it. And I remember reading about, I'm sure, I don't know if you all heard of Anne Lamott. She's what is the book she wrote? Bird by Bird or something like that. But it stuck with me. She wrote, just don't sit there and think about what someone's going to think about what you write. Just start writing it. Now, she said in a fiction book, you can always change the names later. No one will know. But I did that. I just started writing. And I think the hardest thing, and I've gotten permission to say this, is that there were some things I talked about that were negative about family members, particularly Larry's family members. And that the two of us had long conversations about whether it was okay to talk about that. And it hasn't been easy because some of the people have read this book. So it's made it kind of tricky. And so sometimes I wonder, well, should I have included that? Should we have decided to include it? But on the other hand, both of us in our discussions said, it's just important to tell the whole story. If these other couples are going to tell their stories, then we should be willing to tell our stories too, both positive and negative. And so that's what it came down to. The weirdest thing about it, the funniest thing that happens sometimes is we'll be walking our dogs in our neighborhood. And this has happened so many times. And a neighbor will come up to us and say, oh, that's so interesting about how when the two of you went to Maine, you did such and such. And I'm thinking, wait a sec, how did you know that? And they'll say, oh, we read your book. I'm like, oh my gosh, I completely forgot. And that's happened several times. We actually had a neighbor bring us an anniversary present because they figured out in the book the date that we got married. And I thought, wow. So it's funny, those kind of things you don't think about, I guess.
You kind of already answered this in the last question, but I wanted to go ahead and explicitly ask in case you wanted to expand. Or Larry, if you wanted to say something, which is, how did you feel about being involved in this process? And I guess in this happening in general.
Okay. He's shy. He doesn't want to. I would. There's so many ways to answer this question. Larry is the most supportive person, and he's always been supportive of the things I do. And so that's been amazing after all, because I had to spend so much time doing this, and it still takes time doing things that, he sacrificed, I think, by not having times we could be doing something together, but he's been wonderful about it. And every time I would say, should I tell this part of our story? How do you feel about that? He'd always say, no, I think you should tell it. I think it's important. He read through so many of the drafts and would give me feedback. And so I think in a lot of ways, I don't know if you do, Larry, but in a lot of ways, although I wrote the book, in a lot of ways, he's been such a part of the project too. A lot of times it feels like he's one of the authors of the book. So,
Thank you.
Yeah. How are we doing in time?
It's 12:56.
Okay, you just tell me when to stop. I can babble on for a while. So, okay. Is there anything you can share with, I'll come back to the next question because I'm still thinking about it. Is there anything you can share with us that other readers do not have the privilege, to learn? And I jotted down a few things. I was thinking about that. The one is the relationship satisfaction question. That's something that is not included in the book. And one of the things that couples would talk about in terms of relationship satisfaction is, and you see this in the literature with other same-sex couples, is that couples would say things like, I feel like we understand each other better because we're both men or both women. Couples would say, you know, when it comes to like household responsibilities, we don't have those gender stereotypes that are changing in society, but still can be there sometimes. And so we kind of have to make a determination of what we're going to do based on what we like. Like in Larry's and my relationship, I love to cook. It's my relaxation after I've been in my head all day on the computer with students. And Larry's a good cook too, but he kind of has let me take that on because I love to cook so much. I absolutely hate folding clothes. I don't know why. There's this huge barrier and they'll sit there in a pile. And so Larry doesn't mind, so he's kind of taking that on. So I've heard couples say that a lot, little things like that. In terms of things that did not bring them satisfaction in the relationship, money was one of the things that came up a lot, as you'd expect. One of the hardest things for same-sex couples is when one person is more out than the other. So you'd have situations where you'd have one person in the relationship who was completely out to their parents and to even at work, but then the other person just was so afraid to come out to their parents because of the repercussions that would come and because they were afraid what would happen to their jobs. That can create a lot of dissonance in a relationship and a lot of difficulties. The other thing I didn't talk about that is what about couples where one person is HIV positive and the other person is HIV negative, and they've been in a relationship for years. How does that affect their relationship? Then you also have, and this is the same for heterosexual couples, interracial relationships. How does somebody who is, one couple in particular I think can think about how, especially in a state like Mississippi, with all the terrible history we have on race relations and on the way that African Americans have been treated over the years, what's it like for somebody in an interracial relationship where you have, for instance, one couple where you have a Black woman and a white woman? How does the white woman understand the same experiences that the Black woman's had? And does the Black woman feel that the white woman understands what she's been through? And so one of the things I don't talk about, I've been talking more about in my talks, is this whole concept that plays into this of intersectionality of identities. So people talk about the idea of double and triple minority. So if somebody is a Black female lesbian, and there's a woman in the book that talks about this, and she's in fact, she says, it's a better way to say it, she says that she's in this job and she's been trying to move up for years. And she says, I feel like that I'm working all the time and I'm not moving up. And so she says, I quote this in the book, she says, a woman says to her work, I don't understand why you're not, why you haven't been moving up. You're doing double the work of the men in this place. And she says, I'm a woman, I'm Black, and oh my gosh, I'm gay. I mean, I have to work 3 times as hard as everybody else. I'm paraphrasing now, because, I have to work harder than the men to try to get someplace here. And so that's that whole concept of intersectionality with the way that identities intersect, somebody being both female and gay or lesbian, or somebody being Hispanic or African American and gay, how those things affect them. It's a big issue that people have written books about, and you could just write another book. So.
Another question, what's it been like to publish a book during COVID?
Oh, that's such a great question, because I'm getting ready to write a blog post on this because the press asked me to do this. It's been absolutely insane. I didn't know what to expect anyway, When it first started, I have to be honest, since we're just talking to a small group of people here and no one's watching online. But when it first started and I didn't have to go do the first book signing,
This will be put on YouTube if you don't want to say, if you want to say something, if you want to confirm.
Oh, okay, no, it's nothing bad. I was just going to say, the first time I didn't have to go to something, I was kind of relieved because I was so nervous about it. And I thought, at the time, like a lot of people, well, this is only going to be for a couple of weeks where we hibernated in our houses. But as it's gone on, it's just been, and other authors I've become friends with have said it's just been really difficult because you can't go out and do these book signings or these talks with other people. On the other hand, what's been fascinating to me is I've become friends with these two other gay authors at University Press of Mississippi who published books at the same time. And the three of us got in touch with each other because we were like, how do we promote our books during COVID? You know, how do we do more events like we're doing right here? And one of the men is in New York City. The other one's at Wisconsin, teaching at a university there. And the three of us have been meeting every Friday afternoon. And we talk about ways we can promote our books and promote each other. And over the past month, we've actually started a podcast together. And we're doing a podcast with, it's called the New Books Network. And we're doing a podcast on LGBTQ studies where we interview other authors who've written books in these areas. And it's been one of these things that I didn't expect to happen when I wrote a book, that I would start making friends with other people in these areas. So it's, you know, I don't know if it's the right thing to say, or maybe it's overused to say a positive come out from a negative, because obviously COVID's the most negative thing that could happen right now. But it's this funny positive thing that's come out of it for me that I probably wouldn't have met them if I hadn't been having to do things online, and if the three of us hadn't intentionally connected, because we were just trying to figure out what can we do to promote our books during this whole thing. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question, and looking at okay, I might mess this up, but one of our coworkers actually got the seminary of the Presbyterian Church, and I'm sorry if my terminology is off. Linda, please forgive me. And asked if you found that, especially through your interviews, that there is more acceptance in various churches in the South since same-sex marriage has been legalized. Personally, I haven't seen this happening, but she'd like to hear your experience.
The Episcopal Church is a great example of, in fact, it's what I heard over and over again from couples. It's what really, I kind of knew this already, but it surprised me to the extent. There aren't many churches overall that are very, very supportive of same-sex couples today in Mississippi. There are more, like there's MCC in Jackson and Hattiesburg, and they're Unitarian churches. And then you'll have individual denominations, like Burt Montgomery in Starkville he's a Baptist minister who's very, very supportive of the gay community. He has a more progressive Baptist congregation. The Episcopal Church kept coming up over and over again among these couples. And I mentioned some of them in the book, but not even the extent that I mentioned here. These small communities that didn't have other churches, didn't have like a Unitarian or an MCC church, they talked about the Episcopal Church in their town. They talked about how it was the one place they felt like they could go, and that they were more likely to be accepted by people in the church and by the minister. And there's this heart-warming story in the book about this older woman talking about the struggle she went through years before when she was trying to decide whether she wanted to leave the church she'd been going to since she was, as long as she could remember. And she goes to the minister at the Episcopal Church, and she sits down in front of her and she's crying, saying, I don't know what to do. I don't know if it's okay to be here. And this minister says to her, don't you know that your love of your partner is a blessing from God, or something like that. It was just beautiful. So I heard a lot of positive stories from people about their experience in the Episcopal Church. One couple in the book that was willing to share their picture actually shows a picture of them getting married in the Episcopal Church. They up in Vermont, but still, that was very, very positive. Yeah.
That's all the questions.
That's all the questions.
Right now. Oh, that's it. That's it.
Well, I can keep talking, but I didn't know if that,
No, that's it for right now.
Okay, perfect. This has been great. Thank you very much.
All right. From the chat questions, if you would like to elaborate or follow up on something, Please do. I've been really enjoying this.
Okay, well, I'm happy to go on. I didn't know if you had a deadline and when you should stop talking, so. Okay, let's see is there anything, this is a good way to end probably. Are there any last thoughts or comments that you would like to share? One of the things I kind of brushed on a little bit, but I didn't talk about is the laws in Mississippi and how it's affected couples' decisions on whether or not they want to stay in Mississippi. In the last chapter, I talk about couples' decisions on why they are staying and whether or not they want to go someplace else in the future. The couples who are younger, and I would say younger than 40, were the ones who were likely to say that when they can, they want to leave. They want to go someplace else, obviously after COVID, where they can have more job opportunities, have more opportunities to be around a diverse gay community. And it's a really big concern of mine, and I think a lot of people in our state, because I cite this in the book. There's actually some research that came out from the IHL board of Mississippi, all the major universities, that talked about, I don't think they said this, but an article quoted it as a brain drain, that there's a huge percentage of students when they graduate from Mississippi universities that leave the state, and it's a really big concern. And so for gay people, gays and lesbians, that's another group that are leaving for the reasons other people leave, but also because of these laws that have been passed in the state. And I think that, I guess I'm getting preachy here, but if the politicians in our state would look at how there's a potential to keep in our state some really good people who can offer so much to the workforce, to the communities, but that by passing laws that aren't supportive, it's almost like you're saying, we just want to kind of brush you to the side. And that's really concerning to me. The couples who were older than 40 or 50 were more likely to say that they felt torn. There are times when they wanted to leave, but that they wanted to stay because they wanted to make a difference and because they loved the state. It was part of their identities. They grew up in these communities, and not only were they a same-sex couple, but they were also a Mississippian. They were a member of these communities, and they wanted to stay and make a difference. And that was really moving to me to hear those stories. And I guess I'll say in closing that I think that the resilience of people in our state, at least for the people I interviewed, it just amazes me, because people who are continuing to stay in their communities and work to make Mississippi a better place, they're just really impressive people. One of the couples in the book says, and it's always stuck with me, they say that we feel like by living in our communities, a same-sex couple, and in this case, people know who they're out, people know we're a same-sex couple, we've interacted with people, that we're doing as much advocacy and for the gay community than people in the big cities, because we're interacting with people every day. People are seeing that we may be different than you in a lot of ways because we're, in this case, a male couple, but there's so many ways where they're similar to you, and you see how we're making a difference in our communities. And I thought that was such a great comment. So I guess it's a nice positive way to end.